Good evening and welcome. Welcome. My name is Gene Gwill. I'm a member of the board of Tales of Cape Cod, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker this evening. The topic this evening is Letter from Barnstable Jail, William Apess and the 1833 Mashpee Resistance. Sponsors for tonight's program are Polly Brazelton and my wife, Susan Gwill. Next week's program is Tin Ticket, the heroic journey of Australia's convict women, presented by local historian Deborah Weiss. When it comes to connecting people to history, Cape Cod is a place that keeps on giving. From the stories of the Pilgrims' first landing in Provincetown to the Body of the People protest, which occurred on this site. These and other stories have been shared in this building, are diverse, fascinating, and enlightening. But there's one part of our history that deserves much greater attention and much greater understanding. I'm referring to the history of Native Americans who lived here thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. Not only is our understanding of Native American culture, lifestyles, and religions limited, it is generally one-sided and biased. Our speaker this evening is Drew Lopenzia, Professor of Early American and Native American Literature at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Drew earned his BA degree in English from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and his master's and PhD degree at the University of New Hampshire. He is the winner of numerous teaching awards and the author of 3 books. The first, Through an Indian's Looking Glass. The second, Red Ink. The third, An Introduction to Native American Literature. Professor Lopenzio's research has provided a much-needed reinterpretation of Native American experience after their contact with Europeans. He has done this by researching Native American political writings from colonial New England. His presentation this evening will focus on one of the major figures of that period, William Apess. I started my comments this evening with the statement that when it comes to connecting people to history, Cape Cod is a place that keeps on giving. William Apess is a case in point. Apess not only came to Cape Cod, he led a nonviolent protest of Native Americans in Mashpee. He was arrested for his activities. He was tried and sentenced, and we believe he was sentenced in this building. Please join me in welcoming Drew Lopenzia.
Okay, thank you so much, Gene. I'm just going to repeat a couple of things that Gene already said. I'm grateful to Gene and Susan Gwill, who invited me here today, along with Ann Kennedy, to have me present this talk. I've been talking about William Apess now. The book has been out for about 5 or 6 years, and I started with my very first talk in a barn in Coleraine, Massachusetts, where William Apess was born, and about 100 people from this tiny little town, about 10% of the town showed up for the talk, and it's just, one talk has led to another talk. Somebody heard the talk and said, you know what, we'd like to have you present at that talk, and it's just been, that's what evidently brought me here. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to continue to be able to share this story, which I think is a story that more and more people need to know about. I also want to thank other sponsors for this, Polly Brazelton, Tales of Cape Cod, who are sponsoring this event and providing this incredible space in the historic old colonial courthouse. And as I will mention as I move into my talk, I've tried to go in my research everywhere where I know or believe William Apess has been in his life and in his travels, and I was not aware of this space. And so it's really compelling to be here where, as Gene said, we don't know 100% certainty, but this was probably where he stood trial. And it was during that trial, he and 6 others from the Mashpee tribe in 1833, as the court ruling decided that they, with force and arms, unlawfully and riotously, did assemble and gather together to disturb the peace, resulting in a great noise, riot, tumult, and disturbance to the great terror of the said Commonwealth. So if you enjoy tales of great terror, brace yourself. This is it. To which William Apess responded, I am yet to learn what punishment can dismay a man conscious of his own innocence. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, members of the Mashpee tribe who have shown up for our talk today. I need to ask, so I've been doing this since my very first talk in that barn in Coleraine, Massachusetts, which had no air conditioning, by the way. It was really hot in there. So I appreciate that too. How many of you, before tonight's talk, before reading the program or hearing it introduced, had ever heard of William Apess before? Yeah, I know there's a contingency over in that corner over there, and I'm seeing a few hands go up, right? But not many, right? And I want to ask, how many of you have heard of Frederick Douglass? Right, everybody. And I honestly believe that William Apess, who preceded Frederick Douglass, should be, in some ways, is the equivalent for the Native American community, what Frederick Douglass would be to the black community some 20 years later, that he's that important, that his writings are that important, that he had that kind of significant of an impact, although his life was much shorter and he didn't have the time to perhaps mature into the role that Frederick Douglass ultimately did. But this has been my goal. I'd like William Apess to be a household name on a par with Frederick Douglass. So now you guys can help me spread the word from here on in. So let's begin. If I can find my clicker. The first glitch of the evening. Gene, did you have the... Oh, I'm sorry, I have it. So, first of all, that is the old colonial courthouse that we're sitting in. I originally had Barnstable Jail up on the picture here. I changed my mind about that because I thought this space is really significant as well. But let's, and that's me, Drew Lopenzia. So, who is William Apess? First of all, we come into, we'll start with a little bit of a history lesson this evening, but I think all of us come into our sense of Native American identity and history in the United States with a lot of misconceptions. And what we're looking at right here, this is actually a painting from 1832 entitled Metamora, Last of the Wampanoags. And this is actually a white man. It's Edwin Forrest. He was an actor in the 1830s, and he played the role of Metamora, or King Philip, actually for 20 years. It was the most popular play in the United States. And every night he would reenact on the stage the death of King Philip. And there's this idea that we have, I mean, culturally, when we think of Native American people, we tend to think of this kind of romanticized image, the noble warrior. It's a beautiful image. There's nothing wrong with it, but there is a kind of harm that we do, kind of violence that's done when we can only think of this one image when we want to represent Native American people and Native American culture, and we don't think of Native people beyond this role, that perhaps they were also fathers and parents and mothers and diplomats and sons and daughters and people who lived day-to-day lives without having to necessarily, raise up the war hatchet and the face paint every night. So this is William Apess, and perhaps not the image that we had in mind when we think about what a Native person might be looking like in the 1830s. But William Apess was, although in some ways extraordinary, in many ways he was typical. William Apess, first of all, was a member of the Pequot tribe. The Pequot today are still with us in southern Connecticut on the Long Island Sound. William Apess came from that tribe. He came to Mashpee and he was adopted into the Mashpee tribe. He was born in 1798 in Coleraine, Massachusetts. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Coleraine? Well, all right, I'm a little, well, yeah, okay. Coleraine in 1798 was a town of about 1,900 people, a small little backwoods colony that was establishing itself. It's still a town of about 1,900 people today when I first went there and began my research there. Nevertheless, that is where William Apess was born. We know this. There's no birth certificate. There's no record of his birth there, except for the fact that he tells us this. He wrote it. He wrote books. He published them, and that's how we know that he was born in Coleraine, Massachusetts. Nobody bothered to keep records of these things. As a youth, he was indentured into service with white families in the area of Colchester, Connecticut, when his family moved him back there. I want to emphasize this was not unusual. This was the norm for Native children. Most Native families, they were in economic dire straits. Their families and their communities had been devastated by settler colonialism, and they could not support their own families. Often the fathers or caregivers had to travel many, many miles to work as servants themselves, as itinerant labor, or on whaling ships where they were gone for years at a time, and they could not support their own children quite often, or even if they could, the town nevertheless took it upon themselves to bond their children out to white families, where they served as free labor for those families. Nevertheless, William Apess broke his bond service and he ran away at the age of 15. He ran away to New York City and he was immediately conscripted into the U.S. Army. Even though he was underage at the time, he was too young to serve. Some recruitment officers ran across him, got him drunk, signed his enlistment papers, lied about his age. I've seen his enlistment papers. It said he was 18. He was only 15 years old at the time. And he went and fought in some of the most harshest battles in the War of 1812. We tend to think of Native people, when we think of them in this context at all, as adversaries to the U.S. as a military force. It's always the cowboys against the Indians, so to speak. Nevertheless, Native Americans served alongside the United States and the colonies before that in every single war that we have ever fought in our entire history. And so this was also typical for a Native man to be serving as a soldier in the U.S. Army in the War of 1812. As a matter of fact, the Mashpee community themselves in the Revolutionary War saw anywhere from 50 to 80% of their tribe enlisted in the war, and they had a mortality rate of, well, it depends on who you listen to, but of about 80% in the war who died fighting for American independence. In 1831, where he departs from most of his fellow natives, is he became an ordained Methodist minister. It was a long road for him to get there. He had to overcome many obstacles, but he was ordained and became a minister in 1831. He authors 5 books between 1829 and 1836, another extraordinary accomplishment for somebody who never had any formal education whatsoever. And he used his pulpit in the ministry and his ability to write and publish and to speak eloquently and forcefully to advocate for Native people throughout New England. And so this is a thumbnail sketch of his life. To better understand William Apess, First of all, as I said earlier, I made it my point when I began to research him to just try to go everywhere I knew that he had been. There had been so little comprehensive research to connect the dots of his life, and so I just started going places. And this is the Connecticut River Valley, heading north towards Coleraine, Massachusetts. And he started his autobiography by telling us not long after his marriage, my father removed to what was then called the back settlements, directing his course first to the west and afterward to the northeast, where he pitched his tent in the woods of a town called Coleraine near the Connecticut River. Our misconceptions of indigenous identity, they were certainly rampant in the 1830s, but they can continue to today. As I found my way to Coleraine, this area is marked by the passage of what is today known as the Mohawk Trail, and as I got closer to Coleraine, I saw signs of the old Mohawk Trail, which was the first state scenic highway, apparently, and you'll find these little trading post areas that, again, are representing Native people in ways that they did not represent themselves at this time or any other time in New England. This might be what a Lakota Plains Indian might look like, but this giant figure actually stands right at the foot of the hill where I believe William Apess was born, and so it's just another sense of how Native identity is continuously misrepresented. When I went to Coleraine, I could find no mention of William Apess whatsoever. It was as though he'd never existed. He's the most famous person to ever come out of that town. I parked myself there. I went through the town clerk's office. I went to the local library. No mention of him. Even on their website, no mention of him. And so one of the things I began to think about is we need to put William Apess back on the map and erase the headdress Indian who doesn't belong there and replace it with a real Native identity of somebody who actually lived in this area. And so trying to figure out how to make Apess a permanent feature in the area of Coleraine. And just briefly, one thing that I did find was it looked like most of the settlement in 1798 took place on Catamount Hill, which it's hard to tell how big it actually is from just this little foothill picture of it. But there was a hilltop settlement that was taking place there in the 1790s. It's all overgrown now. You'd never know there was a town up there. But I found a map of it, and it turns out that small town of Coleraine, they're great curators of their own history. And this map showed all the old cellar holes where the first settlers lived up on top of this Catamount Hill. And they know each person who lived in each of these numbered spots, except for this one right here, number 78, which it merely said was the Savage Place. And I can't say for certain, and this is the problem with so much of this, is the lack of documentation, but it's the absence of documentation. Every other spot on this hill, it's like, we know the family that was there, but this place, nobody knows who was there. And so I assume that's where William Apess was born in 1798. And I was able to locate one of the larger cellar holes on the hill, the Farnsworth estate, and from there, I was able to put a GPS of today's, overlay it on the old map and follow an old stone wall up from here to where I believe the spot was, marking the property line. And that ultimately took me to the spot. And here we have Marge Bruchak and Lisa Brooks, two Abenaki scouts who were helping me out, to the spot where William Apess was born in 1798, I believe. And so I'm standing on the spot there. Marge Bruchak, who's a bit of a tracker herself, she told me afterwards that right in the spot where the sun is shining there was a big steaming hunk of bear poop right there. And so we decided it was probably a good idea to get out of there at that point. So William Apess was probably born up on that hill. His family moved back to Colchester, Connecticut, which is closer to where Pequot territory was at the time. And it was while he was living in Colchester at the age of 5, his parents split up and left him. And the fragmenting and fracturing of Native families was just an unfortunate reality of living under this immense pressure of economic and cultural pressure of living under settler colonialism at that time. And William Apess, after saying where he was born and moving back to Colchester, he writes in his autobiography, A Son of the Forest, this really compelling story that's hard to understand. He talks about how his grandmother, who he was living with in a little 2-room shack, came in one night after she'd been selling her baskets and brooms, and he says she was drunk. She'd been drinking rum, and she comes into the cottage, and she starts addressing him and says, "Why do you hate me?" And she says it over and over again, and he doesn't understand what she's saying or why she's saying it. And she says, "Do you hate me?" And he finally says, "Yes." And she proceeds to beat him with a stick, and actually broke his bones in 3 areas on his arm. And I found in the town clerk's office in Colchester the actual doctor's note that said, went to see Indian boy William and wanted to be compensated for his expenses, which included a pint of rum, which I believe he used to anesthetize him to reset the bones in his arm because they had set poorly. So this is, to me, studying William Apess and trying to understand where he's coming from. Why would he open with this story when it was so much easier to perhaps just leave it out? Even today, no matter how far we've come to thinking about domestic abuse and understanding it and how common it actually is, this is not a story most people want to tell about themselves. Certainly not in the 1830s. This wasn't something that people were talking about. And I had to wonder why William Apess would choose to tell this story that might just reaffirm every negative idea that people already had of Native identity at that time. But I think he was also thinking beyond that. He understood that this wasn't his story alone, that this was a story that he was telling through his life, but as a lens to think about the larger indigenous community in Pequot and elsewhere, and that these cycles of abuse were taking place. And until you confront them, until you let sunlight on them, until you put them out in the open and address them, you can't ever get past them. And I think it was an actual act of incredible courage for him to tell this story, but recognize it as part of a systemic happening that didn't just affect him, but that impacted his entire community in so many ways. And so he tells this story, and I think by recognizing these cultural forces and things that were happening in these systemic ways, I think in many ways William Apess was in fact, whatever you may make of this, our very first practitioner of critical race theory. He wrote, "My grandmother had been out among the whites with her baskets and brooms and had fomented herself with the fiery waters of the earth so that she had lost her reason and judgment, and in this fit of intoxication raged most bitterly, and in the meantime fell to beating me most cruelly." So William Apess makes it very clear that she was drunk, that the rum was something that white people had foisted upon Native communities, and that before this incident, Native people lived in peace and domestic harmony with one another, but these things had happened. And I wanted to understand the story of William Apess's grandmother as well. What led her to this point, and what might her experience have been? And so I want to take you down that road briefly before we can move on to the main part of this presentation. And so the first part of it is understanding that settler colonialism happened. And when this area was settled by the Plymouth colonists in 1620, and then the Massachusetts colony 10 years later. This was actually the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I don't know if you've all ever seen this image before. Some of you may have. But this idea, if you can see what's coming out of his mouth, there says, "Come over and help us." I can assure you no Native ever stood on the shore and say, "Hey, we need your help." But it was useful for the Massachusetts Bay Colony to think of themselves that way. They believed that they could sort of, this was their corporate logo, their Nike swoosh. So we could pretend that this is a benign operation and we're bringing Christianity to these people who, as they said, have forever sat in hellish darkness. And this was easy to do. William Bradford, one of those first settlers who came to this area, had this idea that North America was this vast wooded desert space. As he wrote in his Of Plymouth Plantation, what could they see when they came here but a hideous and desolate wilderness filled with wild beasts and wild men? And these words had an impact. He wrote this sometime around 1630 or so, but 200 years later, people are still carrying that forward. And 400 years later, people still believe this was just a forested wasteland, and native people were just running around chasing deer and moving through the forest with no kind of civilization to speak of. Let's walk back from that a little bit. So first of all, if you believed that this was just a desert wilderness, then of course that entitled you to imagine that, well, we can just claim this land because it's empty space and nobody lives here. And so they did. This is an early map of the colonies, and you can see that colonists projected that they could imagine their state lines going ad infinitum. They didn't even know what was beyond that. This was as far as their map went, but nevertheless, they felt free to claim that empty land for themselves. However, it wasn't empty land, and native people didn't live in these isolated pockets of wilderness. In fact, we know from just this one archaeological dig, and this is just one example. I could cite so many others, but it's illuminating that in this one dig from Chillicothe, in what is today the area of Columbus, Ohio, archaeologists have found obsidian that came from the Rocky Mountain area, grizzly bear teeth that came from that area, copper from the Great Lakes region, silver from up around Montreal and Quebec, shark's teeth from, Cape Cod, Barnstable, and all these other items that have found this way into this one site because the North American continent was actually connected by trade routes and river routes, and there was vast, extensive trade networks, not just of goods, but also of agricultural supplies as well. I don't know how many of you at this point have ever heard of Cahokia. You guys, are you familiar with Cahokia? Few of you maybe. Cahokia existed right across the river from what is today St. Louis. And this is an artist's rendition of it. This was a large urban center. It held up to about 20,000 people at this time. It was comparable to any European city. You don't feed 20,000 people by running around the woods chasing deer. You grow corn. This is one of the most agriculturally productive places in the world. And they grew corn, beans, squash, and other goods. They had surplus goods that they could trade to other communities similar to this one all around, scattered about throughout the U.S. And we don't learn about this. This is not something we're taught about in our history, that there were these big urban centers right here in the middle of North America. In fact, this history has been erased, and so we grow up not understanding that it exists. But it's still there today. You can visit it. It's a National Heritage Site. I've had students who came from St. Louis, had no idea this place existed, but it's still there. It's hard to miss. The mounds are about 7 stories high. It's giant, and these are just portions of communities that were scattered throughout the continental U.S. John White was one of the earliest settlers to come here from the Roanoke colony. In the 1580s, he was a painter. They didn't have photographers back then, but they sent a painter over. And this is what he saw: villages with corn growing everywhere, fortified villages, native people living in these towns, and agriculture as far as the eye could see, cleared land, surplus agricultural goods. Samuel de Champlain, when he came here in 1607, drew a map of Massachusetts Bay. And what did he see? But villages with corn everywhere you could look. This was a huge, vast, cleared agricultural space. It was not the desert wilderness that William Bradford described. William Bradford knew this himself. He saw it with his own eyes, despite what he reported. So Mort's Relation, one of the earliest tracts to come out of that colony, written by Edward Winslow and William Bradford himself, as they were exploring the area of the Nemasket River, and really wherever they went. But he wrote, "The head of this river is reported to be not far from the place of our abode. Upon it are in heaven many towns, it being a good length. The ground is very good on both sides, it being for the most part cleared." In the very same tract, in another breath, he said, "Their land is spacious and void. There are but few who run over the grass like wild beasts. They are not industrious, neither have art, science, skill, or faculty." In other words, with a stroke of the pen, you can say they were agricultural people, towns everywhere you look, cleared lands, and then you could just make it all go away. And we've chosen to remember the second half of this narrative. So, the native people of this area and throughout the North American continent were not people devoid of science, agriculture, law, religion. They practiced three sisters agriculture in the Northeast. It means they grew beans, squash, corn. These particular vegetables had a kind of symbiotic relationship that helped them to grow. And so they actually, the natives of this area had bounteous agricultural yields. In fact, the settlers here in Virginia, where I live now, and across the eastern seaboard, not a single settlement could have survived without surplus native agriculture. They simply could not have lived without native agriculture. And so to think that it didn't exist is not only ludicrous, but is a kind of willful ignorance on our part. They had large communities. This is actually an image of a Haudenosaunee community, but early settlers write of towns and structures that could fit hundreds of people in one building, in the main building in the town. They practiced religion and had their own ways of keeping history. What we're looking at right here, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but these are wampum belts and beads that are made from the quahog shells that could be found here. And these beads were ways of recording history. They were used in ceremonies. They were used in almost every ceremonial aspect of community life. They were also, they also had diplomatic purposes, and so these beads could be used or were understood to be able to not only record history. This is one of the most famous belts. It's called the Hiawatha belt, and it tells the story of the formation of the 5 nations of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. But it also it shows, it's kind of like a map. It shows their spatial geography from east to west: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. But it also tells their creation story, and it keeps that story. And these belts were created not only to record that history, but to be used in diplomatic relations, so that if two parties were to come together, the wampum could be understood to help to heal and bind the wounds of war, so that people could come back together and make reasonable agreements to learn how to live beside one another. The Mashpee are still making wampum belts today. This is a recreation of sorts of King Philip's belt that has been made by people in the Mashpee community, and shows the great tree that is part of the origin story, and various clan totems and other symbols that tell important parts of Mashpee history. So wampum still being used today to record history and used for diplomatic purposes. But for the settlers, wampum had one clear use, and that was it could be used as money. So most of us, when we think about wampum, we think of it as Indian money. This is a misnomer. Native cultures, they were not capitalist cultures. They lived by trade and barter and other systems of exchange. But as you can see here, this was the Dutch seal at the time, and it shows, I'm sorry, jumped ahead a little bit. And it shows the connection that settlers made was, what am I doing here? That this in the middle is a beaver, and these beaver furs could be exchanged. Wampum beads, which were viewed as worthless shells that had no value to a colonist, could be exchanged for these valuable furs, and through this, colonists understood that they could maintain their investments, pay back their investors in the mother country. And so this was the Dutch seal that made this relationship very specific. When the English settlers found out about this, they decided that they immediately had to control the wampum trade. And so they declared war against the Pequot, because it was in the Pequot area between the Thames and the Connecticut River that most of the quahog shells tended to wash up, and that was at the very foot of the wampum trade. And so they declared war. It was an offensive war against the Pequots. The Pequots had done nothing to provoke the English up until that point. And in 1636, the settlers sent an expedition out against the Pequot. They surrounded their main village. What you see here is the English army. They had Narragansett scouts who had helped bring them there. And they surrounded the village, and when they couldn't attack it by force, they decided to retreat, form a circle around it, and they put it on fire, and they burned everybody alive within that fort. The Narragansett, who stood around them at this point, when they saw what the English did, one of the English captains recorded that they said, "Your war is too furious. It slays too many men. We don't want anything to do with this." They had never seen anything like this before. John Mason was the captain who led the expedition to the Pequot village. There's a statue of him today outside the Connecticut State House in Hartford. He wrote at the time, "Thus was God seen in the mount, crushing his proud enemies and the enemies of his people, burning them up in the fire of his wrath and dunging the ground with their flesh. It was the Lord's doing." One of the earliest tracts to come out of the New England colony was called New England's First Fruits. This was a religious tract celebrating the first conversions. Remember, come over and help us. We want to convert natives to Christianity. Well, the first fruits were the Pequot children who were the survivors of that war and saw their parents and loved ones destroyed in those flames. And they were now brought to be bondservants to the English colonists and were also considered to be Christian converts. The settlers began to try to convert the local native tribes. John Eliot is famous for his efforts to go supposedly out into the woods to convert natives. Images like this abound throughout Massachusetts today. This is in a church, this is in the State House in, this is the City Hall in, I believe, Natick today. This image exists, and it shows John Eliot up on a rock preaching to the natives. Again, John Eliot did preach to the natives, but he went to their villages. He didn't preach to them in the woods. They lived in village spaces. And so these images, once again, perpetuate falsehoods. This is an image of the Indian College. Not many people know this, but in the effort to convert native people, an Indian college was started in Harvard. It was the first permanent brick building in Harvard. This was an early design of it. And it was in that building that the first printing press in the colonies was housed. And it was run by native people who were brought in, converted to Christianity, and learned, along with other Harvard students, how to speak Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and could translate also from the Algonquian language, or from the English to the Algonquian language. And so they began to produce the very first Bible to be published in America in that college space. And it's known as the Eliot Bible or the Indian Bible. It was first published in 1663. And it was written in the Algonquian language. So the first Bible to be printed in what is today the United States was printed in the Indian College by native people who translated this work into the Algonquian so that the English could fulfill their mission to bring Christianity to those poor natives as they understood it. Turns out native people didn't want to be converted to Christianity. And when these efforts all failed and other aggressive attempts by the settlers to control and take over native lands became intolerable to native people, King Philip's War broke out. And this is an image of King Philip that was created by Paul Revere. At the time, it shows Philip wearing the belt that we mentioned earlier, the Wampanoag belt, that has been recreated or refashioned in recent times. But King Philip's War broke out, and this was ultimately a devastating war for native people. It was the last military resistance for native people within the area of the settled colonies at that time. And I'll just quote Paula Peters from the Wampanoag tribe for Inner Peace of Patuxet. It was difficult, if not impossible, for colonial leaders to acknowledge the credibility of their native neighbors. Plymouth, as it overspread Patuxet, launched a wave of colonialism that would ultimately consume the Wampanoag territory that included as many as 69 villages throughout the coastal region as what is today known as Massachusetts and Rhode Island. King Philip was hunted down, and he was killed by Benjamin Church. And as William Apess wrote in his last major publication, a eulogy on King Philip, he noted the place where Philip fell was very muddy. One of those tender-hearted Christians exclaimed, "What a dirty creature he looks like." And we have also Church's speech upon that subject, who said, For as much as he has caused many a pilgrim to lie above ground, unburied, to rot, not one of his bones shall be buried. Accordingly, he was quartered and hung upon 4 trees, after which his head was sent to Plymouth and exposed upon a gibbet for 20 years. This is what William Apess's grandmother was carrying around with her, along with those baskets, is a history of concentrated violence against the Pequot people, against Native people, attempts to force them into Christianity, attempts to dismantle their culture and to leave them destitute without economic possibilities. And as William Apess himself noted, let a gentleman or lady of integrity visit these places, and they would be surprised as they wandered from one hut to the other. They would view with the females who are left alone, children half starved, and some almost naked as they came into the world. While the females are left without protection and are seduced by white men and are finally left to become common prostitutes for them and to be destroyed by that burning, fiery curse, rum. This is the story that William Apess, throughout his career in his various publications, is trying to bring to the fore, to make people understand not that his grandmother was a cruel individual, but that there was a cruel, intolerable history of injustice that she was carrying and that became part of the cycles of violence within which, this is not something he's speaking about abstractly, this was the life he lived. He was that child who was half starved and almost naked in the world, watching the women be destroyed around him and people like his grandmother trying to hold it together as best they could. And by telling this story, I think William Apess is trying to confront these cycles of violence, to bring them into the light so that people can finally somehow begin to get past them. So, that was William Apess. He was bound out at that point, taken from his grandmother, and brought to the family of David Furman. And he lived with the Furmans for the next 8 years or so. He worked for their, he worked as a laborer. I found David Furman's field for what it's worth. Just another place that I visited. When you go to that field today, there's the field. If you turn around, you see the Indian Field Campground, which is a really curious and bizarre place that has little avenues called Geronimo Way and Sitting Bull Lane. Again, a completely warped geography imposed upon what was Pequot and Mohegan territory at the time. William Apess has a recollection of Mrs. Furman taking him to the family graveyard, and he mentions it in his book, and I was able to find that graveyard, and that helped me locate where he had spent those years of his childhood. Nevertheless, like I said, William Apess ran away from his indenture, and this was a way that he took control of his own life, really. Most Native youths were supposed to serve out their indenture until they were 21, and then they went on to less promising things from there. But William Apess ran away. This was a ad that William Williams, who was his master at the time, put an ad out in the paper offering 1 cent reward if anybody could find an Indian boy, William Apess, aged 15 years. I don't know how bad he actually wanted him back, but nevertheless, it confirms these aspects of William Apess's story as he tells it. And he went to New York, and he immediately got conscripted. The recruits for the War of 1812 were brought to Governor's Island at the time, and I went there. There's the old barracks house where soldiers might have been stationed. He was brought up the Hudson River brought up the Hudson River. He was stationed in Greenbush for a very short time near Albany, and then he was brought up to Plattsburgh. And most people don't know this about the War of 1812, but Plattsburgh, the Canadian border, was where most of the main fighting took place. And some of the major skirmishes that happened, or major battles that took place there, William Apess was involved in. And I was able to go up there. This is where the troops were quartered. It's all apartments now, but this is where he would have been quartered there. And I crossed the line into Canada. He describes the blockhouse at Lacole Mill. The Battle of Lacole Mill took place there. Amazingly, he describes this in quite some detail in his account, but the building that he describes where the British blockhouse that they attacked is still standing there today. He was involved in the major battle of the war, which was the Battle of Plattsburgh on land and the Battle of Lake Champlain on sea. It's interesting, so when I went up there, one thing that most of us know about the War of 1812 is that the British came into Virginia and they burnt down the Capitol building, and so a lot of the records were destroyed. So we have no records of William Apess's service after his enlistment, but I was able to, after digging through just ephemera and weird books that I ran across, that I finally reached page 149 and came across this completely arbitrarily. But there is William Apess, private, listed, with the payroll, so that meant that he was under Thomas McKinnon, corporal, and that he was with Captain Brooks's regiment with the artillery, and that is what he describes in his account. And so this was the fort that he was stationed at during the Battle of Plattsburgh. For 7 days, the town was under siege. He helped defend that fort. It's the only one that's still standing, the earthworks of the fort by the Saranac River, and that's where he was stationed in Plattsburgh during that 7-day battle, which the United States ultimately won, and that was the major decisive battle of the war. So after that, William Apess wandered around for a while. I think he deserted from the army. There's no record of him being properly marshaled out. He went up to Canada. He stayed with the Tyendinaga Mohawk for a while, up here in the area of what is today Kingston, Ontario. I went up there and I looked around a little bit. They have the Little Crow Cafe on the Tyendinaga Reservation makes a really nice smoothie. But ultimately, William Apess made his way back. And so it's interesting just to note that in his life so far, he's been following what are actually the old wampum routes, just completely arbitrarily. But these were the old trade routes in which wampum was traded from the Connecticut River up into Haudenosaunee territory, as far as Quebec and Montreal, into the Great Lakes region. And he finally made his way back down from Canada. He walked, and now he's only about 18 or 19 years old. He walked roughly 600 miles all the way back finally to his home in Colchester, Connecticut. And so I want you to imagine at this point that William Apess himself is a child. He's seen his parents leave him. He was beaten horribly by his grandmother. He served as a bond servant for white families, doing labor for them. They also beat and whipped him and treated him poorly, which is why he ran away. Then he gets conscripted into the army at the age of 15. He sees some of the harshest combat of the war. This was a guy who had been through everything you could possibly put a human being through. And really, you could say, how could this guy even put one foot in front of the other and keep going? But somehow, he refortified himself, and he got back to Colchester, and he reconnected with his Pequot community, and he became kind of he was mentored by his Aunt Sally George. Aunt Sally George was a Pequot woman who was really the spiritual leader of the community, of the Pequot community of that time, and she kind of took Apess under her wing, and she used to lead camp meetings out in the woods, and she was the community leader, she was the spiritual leader. She sort of taught Apess how to use religion as a force to bring this fragmented community back together. And Apess took that lesson to heart. He began to educate himself, and he began to go to these camp meetings, and he spent the next 10 years of his life working his way through the Methodist Church. Now, he found out his father was back in Coleraine, and so Coleraine doesn't leave the picture yet. He goes back to Coleraine in 1820, and he finds his father. And this just happens to be a picture of Coleraine in 1820, what it looked like at that time. And he goes back, I believe, up to Catamount Hill, and that's where he joins the Methodist community up there, and he begins preaching on his own. The Methodists used to meet, apparently, at this little place. It's called the Dens, and it's a natural amphitheater. And this is where William Apess describes himself beginning to find his voice, and he would just speak extemporaneously. You know, the Spirit would move him to talk, and he'd speak about his experience, and people were moved by the way he presented himself in this kind of format. And so they, and that's just me in a cave up at the Dens, they asked him to preach. And so he describes so now he's 20 years old. He's not ordained, but he's asked to preach at what was the old schoolhouse up on Catamount Hill. And this is a painting of the old schoolhouse that is being remembered by Coleraine historians for different reasons, but the site is still there, and that's where William Apess gave his very first sermon, up at that church. And he describes he'd never given an actual sermon before. He wasn't ordained. He says, I found a large congregation assembled at the schoolhouse. I now thought I was in a sad predicament. I had never preached. And they actually started to throw things at him, as he recalls. But then he said he sort of found his voice and he found his presence. And he says he began to move them. And they asked him back a week later. And then before he knew it, he was going to churches all around the area, preaching to people in the community. And he had a presence and a charisma. But people were also coming because it's a novelty to come see the Indian kid preach, and that drew crowds. And William Apess was never above using that to his advantage when he could. One of the interesting things I found in Coleraine, moving the story along now, is that William Apess, this place mattered to him, and he wrote down at one point all the names of his children, some of whom were born in Coleraine, and so he left a record up in that hill of his presence there, and the blood that he had up in those hills. He had a brother who had died up there, a brother he never knew, so he had blood in the soil. He had births of his children there, his father was there, and so this was an important place for him. I will come back to that briefly. But after that, I began to follow William Apess by his books. He started publishing books, The Son of the Forest in 1829. This is the only image of William Apess that exists today. It was painted in 1829 by John Paradise, a Methodist painter. And we don't know what happened to the actual painting, but the image was placed in the book. And he was ordained in 1831 into the Protestant Methodist organization. And then I can follow William Apess through newspaper ads. Colonists aren't necessarily interested in tracking William Apess's life. There are no letters of William. Nobody saved his letters. He wasn't important enough to save his manuscripts. His letters heard about him when he died enough to do that. But there is a record, and he went and he preached, and you can follow his life through newspaper ads and see all the different places he went to. This was the Frankfurt Church in Boston, I believe. He was as far as Georgetown in Virginia. I think this was 1831. In 1836, he was doing his his eulogy on King Philip, and advertisements for that. And I can trace a lot of Apess's journeys all around New England and beyond through newspaper ads up until that point. And then in 1833, he published a book called 5 Christian Indians of the Pequot Tribe. And with that new book in hand, like he often did, he took the show on the road. He created speaking engagements for himself, and he would sell his books at these engagements. And it was in 1833, with a pile of these books in his knapsack, that he came to Mashpee for the first time. And so William Apess probably understood what he was getting into, because what was happening in Mashpee had happened in Pequot, had happened in Mohegan. It was happening everywhere in Indian country, if you will, at the time. Wherever Native people lived and held on to land, there had been struggles going on, and Native people had been fighting for the right to claim that land to themselves. This is just one of the many Mashpee petitions from 1752. It says just briefly, this was conveyed to us by Indian sachems. Our former Indian sachems were called Watamalkan, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce all these names, but in Barnstable County, the Mashpee Indian place. This Indian land, this was conveyed to us by these former sachems of ours. We shall not give it away, nor shall it be sold, nor shall it be lent, but we shall always use it as long as we live, we together with all our children. And it goes on to say forever and ever. This is a translation. This was written in the Algonquian language originally. And I don't speak Algonquian. The one word that always stuck to me when I read through these documents, because I read through many, many documents like this, one word kept jumping out at me, Mishimi, which means forever. We claim this land as ours forever. I'm sorry, going backwards again. We poor Indians in Mashpee, we truly are much troubled by these English neighbors of ours being on this land of ours and in our marsh and trees. English people were coming in and taking the wood and harvesting their hay and their and marsh grasses and anything that was of value. English people felt entitled to come in and take it. As a matter of fact, legally they had a right to do so, and I'll explain that in a minute. And so they say, therefore now, O you kind gentlemen in Boston and Massachusetts Bay, now we beseech you, defend us. And they would not trouble us anymore on our land. When William Apess first came here, he went to the Mashpee Meeting House. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's still standing in Mashpee today. Established in 1684. He came there thinking he would be preaching to a group of a native audience, native people. This had been built for native people as a house of worship so that they could practice Christianity within their community. When Apess came there to give his sermon, he found a white audience. He found a white congregation. The native people were not allowed to come into the church. They didn't care for the preacher who had been there assigned for the last 20 years. They asked for him to be removed. The overseers would not remove him. And so they didn't come, and they were not given a right to bring their own spiritual leaders into the space that was created for them to hold services the way that they wanted to under what you would think would be under the clause of freedom of religion. William Apess comes here and he discovers this, and he decides that he is going to get together with the Mashpee and do something about it. As he wrote, these pale men were certainly stealing from the Indians their portion in the gospel by leaving their own house of worship and coming to ours. William Apess got together with the leaders of the Mashpee Wampanoag community at the time. This is a much later picture of Blind Joe Amos. He was only in his 20s when William Apess came there. He was a Baptist preacher in the community at the time. Solomon Adequin was one of the leaders of the community. Ezra Adequin were some of the head men of the community, and there were others. And they got together, and because they couldn't go into the church, they came together under what has been described to me as the sacred oaks, and they held their services there, and they joined as a coalition and said, we're going to do something about this. And William Apess sort of came with a strategy. He said, I think I can help you to somehow gain your own community back again and get your church back again and all of these resources that have been taken away from us. So he created a series of resolutions. He said, first of all, Reverend William Apess has requested us to publish the following resolutions. Resolve that we as a tribe will rule ourselves and have a right to do so, for all men are born free and equal. Resolve that we will not permit any white man to come upon our plantations to cut and carry off wood or hay or any other article without our permission after the 1st of July next. They not only made these proclamations, William Apess had developed over his time preaching in cities like Boston and New York. He developed relationships with the local press, including The Liberator, which was run by William Lloyd Garrison. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but William Lloyd Garrison was the major abolitionist newspaper. It was just getting started at the time. This was William Lloyd Garrison, and The Liberator would be the first sort of platform for Frederick Douglass when he finally comes along 20 years later. But William Lloyd Garrison knew William Apess. William Apess had preached in Garrison's church, was the invited preacher there for a whole summer in 1832, and he printed these things. And the idea here, other newspapers helped William Apess out to print these resolutions as well, was to make it transparent. So it wasn't happening somewhere in a vacuum where nobody could see it. He said, let's broadcast to the world, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to begin to enforce it on the 1st of July. And so they did. Now, just to understand what they were actually talking about, native reservations, we don't even think of there being reservations, I think, often in the Northeast. We think of that as something out west. But these reservations, native land that was still being held by native communities, were the native communities technically, these were their lands, but they were governed by a group of appointed white overseers, and these overseers had the power of feudal lords over these communities. They took care of, they didn't take care of, they had control over all of their expenses, their debts. They could say, could declare somebody indigent, take away their children, bond them out to a white family, and this is something that they regularly did. They could assign certain woodlots to white farmers to come and take the wood or the hay or whatever articles and keep it for themselves, and the profit would go to the overseers. And so this was a corrupt institution that made life miserable for Native people. And so what Apess resolved, along with the Mashpee community, is that we're not going to let this happen anymore. And so starting July 1st, they began to patrol their lands. And when they saw white people coming in, as they always had up to that point, to begin to take away their wood, they put a stop to it. Apess wrote about this in his Indian nullification in 1835. He said, "They came in defiance of our resolution to take away our wooden carts. I mildly stated to him the views and intentions of the tribe, saying that it was not their design to wrong or harm any man in the least, and that we wished them to desist for the sake of peace, but it was to no purpose. They said they knew what they were about and were resolved to load their teams. Throughout this transaction, the Indians uttered not a threat or an unkind word, but the white men used very bitter language at being thus for the first time hindered from taking away what had always been as a lawful spoil to them." So this all came to a head, interestingly enough, on July 4th, 1833. The Massachusetts governor was ready to call out the militia to put down what he thought was a revolt, a violent revolt by the Mashpee. And it needs to be understood that William Apess anticipated all of this. And it's why he made everything they did transparent. It's why he did everything peacefully, because he understood even the slightest intimation of violence would bring down undue retaliation on them. And so this became one of the first orchestrated movements of civil disobedience in American history. This was 15 years before Thoreau would begin to even think about writing about civil disobedience. But Apess is practicing it and putting it into motion in a way that proves incredibly effective. So I'm just going to read to you briefly from my book, and then I'm going to begin to wrap this up. So on July 4th, 1833, the two parties assembled. The Governor Levy Lincoln, sent a representative to Mashpee. They wanted to meet in town. I believe they were going to meet right across the street at Crocker's Tavern. The Mashpee said, "No, we will not meet there. We want to meet on our ground, on our church, and the space that was created for us." They weren't allowed in that church. They had to break into it. They had to break into their own church in order to hold the meeting there. And so on July 4th, 1833, the two parties assembled, even though the Mashpees had to break into their own church to gain access to it. This time it was not the inverted congregation seated before Apess, but the true people for whom the meeting house had originally been built. The governor's agent, J.J. Fisk, along with the high sheriff of Barnstable County, John Reed, a local judge by the name of Marston, members of the press, and other curious onlookers all piled into a room that was already packed with 100 or so of the Mashpee themselves. At the insistence of the natives, time was allowed to fetch the reservation's overseers to ensure that they too would hear the grievances to be aired out. And then, in the words of Apess, they now heard preaching in our meeting house as they had never heard before. Apess observes that the locals were expecting to encounter wild Indians armed with tomahawk and scalping knife, that death and destruction and all the horrors of a savage war were impending, and many were too easily persuaded that white people had already been butchered. I'm going to just show you some of the newspaper advertisements. Indian War in Massachusetts. Mashpee Indians being led by one Apess, a well-known half-breed. Hostilities commenced in Mashpee. Trouble in the wigwam. This is truly the fake news of the time. Newspapers, they couldn't send camera crews out there, so they believed whatever they were told. And these ideas that the Mashpee had raised up in arms against the peaceable white people of the Barnstable community was being published all across the country at this time. And just keep in mind that everything, absolutely everything, was done in the most peaceful fashion. And so apparently prior to the meeting, the governor had considered calling out the militia due to hysterical reports by the Indian agent, Gideon Hawley, who insisted that the Indians were in open rebellion and that blood was likely to be shed. The county had readied itself for some kind of full-on revolt, but calmer heads prevailed, and the government agent gave audience to the charges of the Mashpee over the course of the day, although a few in the surrounding community still conspired to ratchet up prevailing tensions by portending bloodshed and murder. These claims of a barely averted riot would echo through the ensuing press reports for months to come, despite Apess's attempts to ridicule the notion of calling out some 50 or 60,000 militia, especially when the great strength and power of the Mashpee tribe was considered. Apparently, 3 of the Mashpee natives coming in from hunting deer had brought their old broken-down rifles with them into the meeting house, and this was interpreted by some as armed insurrection. Such false claims and provocations to violence demonstrate the efficacy of Apess's careful approach, his insistence on full transparency and peaceful means. The slightest gesture of aggression would have justified for the colonial powers every disproportionate countermeasure and was likely to have brought terrible reprisals down upon the natives at Mashpee. As it was, a militarized crackdown was just barely avoided. One wonders if Apess not only precisely orchestrated the Mashpee resistance, but actually planned for it to all come to a dramatic head on the day that America celebrated the birth of its democratic institutions. Having been told that their claims were illegal, Apess stood up to address the agents of state power, speaking, as one of the newspapers said, with an energy that alarmed some of the whites present considerably. He reminded them that their laws were unconstitutional and stripped Native people of their rights as citizens. He reminded Massachusetts of its own revolutionary legacy, how when faced with the crushing weight of an oppressive regime that refused to address their grievances, they at length determined to try some other method. He recollected for the white members of his audience how their forefathers had thrown British tea into the harbor. I'm thinking about the early video we watched here today about this space. And dressed as Indians, no less. And he also reminded those assembled that the Mashpee themselves had fought alongside the colonists in that long-ago war, furnishing them with, as he said, some of her bravest men to fight your battles. Yes, by the side of your fathers they fought and bled, and now their blood cries to you from the ground to restore that liberty so unjustly taken from us by their sons. No doubt it was a fiery and disconcerting history lesson for the white people in attendance. For his troubles, Apess was promptly arrested, and apparently some sort of examination was held that evening at the nearby Cotuit Courthouse, in which a hostile township gathered to ensure justice was done. Apess recalls that excitement ran very high, and he intimated that had the white mob gotten its way, quote, "I doubt not that I should have been ruined forever." In fact, had he not taken such meticulous preparations and precautions prior to his arrest, such would have been his fate. Still, he went along peaceably, insisting, "I was glad they had taken me into custody, as it would lead to an investigation of the whole ground in dispute." Apess perceived that he maintained the moral high ground, and as such understood that a jail sentence would only further publicize the case, bringing into focus the irresponsible use of force at the hands of the state in ways that powerfully negated treasured principles of democracy. Think about this. I mean, William Apess is doing in 1833 what Martin Luther King did in the 1960s. And when he goes to jail, he's sentenced for a month in jail. Well, here's another newspaper article from the time. At the time of Apess's coming among them, they were quiet and peaceable, the Mashpee, and their condition mentally, morally, and pecuniarily improving. At this time comes this intruder, this disturber, this riotous and mischief-making Indian from the Pequot tribe in Connecticut. He goes among the inhabitants of Mashpee, and by all the arts of a talented, educated, wily, unprincipled Indian, professing withal to be an apostle of Christianity, he stirs them up in sedition, riot, treason. He was there, tried in the Barnstable courthouse. That's right here in this very room. Maybe. And in our opinion, never were a trial. The Barnstable Patriot did not like William Apess, I can tell you that. And then he was sentenced to jail for 30 days for trespassing by breaking into a church that was built for Native people to worship in as their preacher, and inciting a riot. He incited, apparently, the white people to riot. I don't know if Apess was held in the old jail at the edge of town. It's very possible that he was. I had to go on the ghost tour in order to get inside that jail. It was great. You should do it. And so he spent 30 days in jail, and while he was in jail, he began to compose what was the Mashpee Memorial, which was a long, comprehensive history of the Mashpee resistance to colonial rule and the imposition of overseers, and a statement and declaration of Mashpee rights that was meant to be presented to the Massachusetts General Court. And when Apess got out of jail, and this is just a copy of the Mashpee Memorial, and a quote from it. I'm not going to read it to you right now, but Apess then when he got out of jail, he immediately took the show on the road like he would do. And he went from town to town, from meeting house to church. He went from Rhode Island, Cape Cod, Connecticut, all the way up to Bangor, Maine, and back again, broadcasting to New England and whatever audience would listen how the Mashpee were being abused by overseers at the same time that everybody in New England was complaining about what was happening to the Cherokee down in Georgia. And it caught people's attention, and this was brought to the Massachusetts legislature in 1834 after the Liberator published his memorial in the newspaper. And it was read before the Massachusetts legislature, and it was unanimously adopted that the Mashpee would be able to incorporate their own township and have control over their own future from this point on. Put that in, it wasn't perfect. But nevertheless, it was a huge step that William Apess had helped to orchestrate. So this is just one episode from his life. There's so much more I could say. His last book, 1836 Eulogy on King Philip, is a really fascinating literary accomplishment that tells colonial history from a native perspective. It was delivered in Odeon Theater in Boston in the 1800s. I tracked down the place where William Apess died. From his coroner's report in New York City, the address was given. The building no longer exists. It's a block-long, huge concrete behemoth, but this was basically where it would have been, where he died. It said that he died of alcohol poisoning. I read the coroner's report to a number of doctors, not telling them what it was, just said, what do you think this is? Each one of them said, without knowing what the other one had said, my wife is a physician assistant, by the way, so I had access to doctors, but they said, that is textbook appendicitis. So he died of something that at that time would have killed anybody. It was not alcoholism, but that was just something that was easy to say about Native people. Isn't it too bad? He drank himself to death. The newspapers were happy to report it. And so this idea of Native people as a vanishing race, as a people who lived in a vast wasted wilderness, that they couldn't compete with modernity, that they had no place in society, William Apess's story really stands in opposition to all of that and helps to highlight and accentuate the fact that this image that we have of Native people is a false image, and that Native people are with us today. They are here in this audience. The Pequot tribe is still with us today in Connecticut. They have a very nice casino you might want to visit. This is their tribal flag. And finally, I'm wrapping up here. I know I've kept you guys a long time. But I went back to Coleraine after the book was published and said, I still want there to be some notice here. I gave the talk in the barn, and 100 people showed up. And then I went to the town selectmen and I said, let's recognize that you had this person here, this amazing person was born in your little town. And they agreed to do more than just write on the sign. They said, yes, we'll put up a marker. I said, it's fine, we'll do it. We'll put it right up in the center of town if you're willing to pay for it. So I began selling T-shirts. I do not have any more, I'm sorry. And I raised enough money to create a marker, a very handsome marker, and we elected this day to unveil it. Of course, it was pouring rain. Still, over 100 people showed up in the rain for that event in Coleraine. It was really impressive the way that the people of Coleraine wanted to adopt the story as well, including people in the indigenous community who were there. This was in 2018. There's the marker in front of the Coleraine Library. I encourage you to go visit sometime. It's a beautiful town. The marker is the highlight, but there's other things to do in the area. The Pecumtuck Homeland Festivals is next weekend, I believe, and so go next weekend. Leave the lovely Cape and brave the Coleraine traffic. We have various people here who were at the unveiling. Ron Wellburn, who was the Director of Native Studies at University of Massachusetts at the time. Marge Bruchak, who's an anthropologist of the Abenaki community. Rhonda Anderson, who is at the Baskin but has lived her whole life or most of her life in Coleraine, and is a very vocal and prominent leader of the indigenous community in that area. And Lisa Brooks in the background. I don't know if you're familiar with Lisa, also an Abenaki historian who recently won the Bancroft Prize in History for her book, The Common Pot. At any rate, actually for her book, Beloved Kin. But all these people came together along with the town of Coleraine to see this marker put up and to support it and speak in behalf of William Apess. And then the town came back 3 years later and said, you know what, we just declared it William Apess Day. And so I had to gather the troops up one more time. This is Barry O'Connell, who first collected William Apess's works, a scholar who first brought William Apess to public attention. He came that day. And a delegation from Mashpee as well. And we were so happy to have them and to represent this connection with William Apess and Coleraine and Mashpee. And so we did it again. Rob Peters from the Mashpee community. There's Mark Bruchak again. There's another shirt. And then we decided we'd send a Coleraine delegation to Mashpee. And that was in March. And it was at the Mashpee Meeting House. There I am with Rhonda Anderson again, and the director of the library at Coleraine. And here we came to see a reenactment of William Apess meeting with Blind Joe Amos and Ezra Adequin and the Mashpee community. We were all comfortably sitting in the church on that March day, and they said, no, we have to go out because we weren't allowed in the church, in the meeting house, and reenacted this meeting between these leaders of the community and William Apess in 1833. And after seeing that reenactment, I want to say that the Mashpee tribe reenacted the adopting of William Apess and his family into the tribe, which was a really beautiful moment. I mean, I had goosebumps watching this happen and just seeing that today William Apess is getting that recognition. And then in April, we did a reading of the eulogy on King Philip at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. And that's me up on the pulpit once again. And it was all indigenous students who were doing the readings, 5 different parts of Apess's eulogy, right around the corner from the old Odeon Theater where it was first read. The Odeon Theater doesn't exist anymore, but this was there when William Apess, just literally like 300 feet away, this building existed when William Apess first delivered it. And these are the members of the indigenous community who read it that day, and that was another beautiful moment. And then there's this moment where we're sitting here in this place where Apess also apparently was, on this floor, having his sentence read to him. And as William Apess would tell you, let peace and righteousness be written upon our hands and hearts is the wish of a poor Indian. And there's the book. I optimistically brought, I think, 10 of them. We'll see. Thank you. Thank you. And I guess there's all sorts of refreshments and stuff like that, so we'll see you all over there.
Okay. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah.
Please join us for refreshments, and Drew will stick around if you've got questions. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, questions, for sure. Do you want to do that here, or yeah? We should do that here, right?
Quick questions.
I know, you all got your eyes on the refreshments now. I blew right past. I'm happy to answer questions, yes.
In your book, you mentioned that when William Apess came to Mashpee, George Ockery
Yeah.
came with him.
That's right.
Could you just tell us a little of that backstory?
So that's the way William Apess presents it in his 1835 publication, Indian Nullification. He sort of makes it sound like he just stumbled upon Mashpee. He was invited to preach at the church, and this is what he did. He just went from town to town, and if he was allowed to give a sermon, he would. And so he makes it sound like it was all kind of a happy accident that he fell into the political situation here and took up the Mashpee cause. Now, there are people in the Mashpee community. Carrie Helmy is the one who told me about George Ockery, that he was a Pequot who ultimately married into the Mashpee tribe, but he had been visiting the Pequot tribe and met Apess and sort of brought him here. And so I think Apess, maybe the point just being that Apess knew what he was getting into, and he came here with purpose, deliberately, understanding that this was a place where he could be of help. I should add that, so he was a Pequot. He went to Pequot. That was the first place that he was stationed was an ordained minister of the Methodist Church. And they didn't like him there either. And I found court records that his house was broken into, and he was beaten within really literally an inch of his life. All I have are the court records of him. It said his whole head was swollen and misshapen. And so you have to understand that the white power structure at the time did not welcome people like William Apess. Even though he was a Pequot, they still called him a stranger, an interloper, all of these things, because he'd been away. He was born in Coleraine. And so they tried to alienate him through those means, but then when that didn't work, they resorted to violence. And so after all the other things that William Apess had been through in his life, all the different traumas that he survived, he also was met with violent confrontation in those very physical ways, and he still kept going, right? I think this is what's really incredible about him, is that he would not back down, but he got driven out of Pequot, and so he went to Mashpee, and this was the next place, having learned lessons there and what happened there, and that's why he told the Mashpee tribe with that resolution, you need to adopt me into the tribe, because they're going to try to make it sound like, again, an interloper, a half-breed, all those ways. They slandered him anyways. They're going to use that. But now he has a certain protection. It was understood that the Mashpee could adopt people into the tribe, that they had that right. And so William Apess tried to use that as part of a strategy so that he could move forward with these initiatives. So that's, and it was George Ockery who sort of brought him here, yeah. Yes?
How did you know the correct pronunciation was last time?
Apess? Okay. This is under dispute. People pronounce it in many different ways, every possible pronunciation that you could. The reason I say Apess is because it probably was, I think, pronounced apes, perhaps Apess, but I think he chose Apess for himself. He changed the spelling from one S to two S's. Probably people were using derisive terminology against him. But I found his wedding, the document that certified his wedding, and the preacher who was there spelled his name A-P-I-S. Now the preacher didn't know how he spelled it. He just heard it phonetically and wrote it down, is my guess. And so that suggests to me that he was not using apes, that he must have said Apess. And so I think that's probably how he presented it himself. But again, that's my best guess. That's what I have to go on. Yes?
I'm curious to ask about his relationship to Christianity. Because being that Christianity was a weapon used against Native people by white people, and yet he became a Methodist minister and had power and
Yeah.
education that way. Can you say more about what his attitude towards religion was, and also including native traditions? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's so hard, I think, for audiences today to wrap their mind around this, but one of the things I was, I guess, trying to suggest, and I know I threw a lot of history at you guys and everything, but native communities, by the time William Apess came along, had been under colonial subjugation for 200 years, and Christianity was not really, all that come over and help us, all the benign language, but it was basically forced on these communities. They had little choice but to adopt it. But 200 years also gives people time to figure out how to use it maybe to your advantage. And I think William Apess understood this was one of the few ways somebody within the native community could have a platform and a voice to speak, and he used it. He could stand up. I mean, he didn't just preach to native audiences. He preached all around Boston, New York, wherever he went, mostly to white audiences, and he had a platform to do that. Otherwise, there is no way for a native person to be able to. And so what he did really effectively is that he used this platform to say, strategically, look, you guys brought us Christianity, but you're being terrible Christians. And from that platform, he could do that, and he could turn the tables on the white audiences and congregations and say, I, as a poor Indian, want you to be better Christians. Can you do this a little bit better? And I think it's a really effective strategy for him at this particular time. One that he used really effectively, but I don't want to. I think it was also sincere. I mean, I think he ultimately did sort of. It's hard to say. So I think he was sincere about Christianity. I think he believed that Christianity was something that perhaps, if you take away all the denominational aspects of it, that whatever Christ was preaching was something that was very relatable to Native people before colonists ever got here. In other words, he thought Native people were just better practicing Christians than white people were, and that they had been all along. Yes?
How did you first learn William Apess?
Well, so he hit me like I hope he's going to hit everybody else when it's like I was in graduate school, had never heard of him, and somehow, how did I get into this whole racket? I have no idea. But when I first read William Apess, I was like, oh, like nobody's talking or writing like this at this time. Nobody's speaking truth to power in this way. So I think a lot of people at this particular moment, when Barry O'Connell, the scholar who first collected all of Apess's works together, that was in 1992. And so that was the first time a lot of people, at least in the white community, were finding out about William Apess. And we're like reading this guy, this voice that we didn't know existed, this voice like it was as powerful as Frederick Douglass would be 15 or 20 years later. And like, it was a revelation. It's like, I want to write about this guy. I want to know more about this guy, first of all. And really, he was, I took my cues from William Apess. Like, this is how I can like sort of strategize what I do as a teacher. And so anyways, it worked for me. And then it turned out nobody had written a biography of him. I couldn't believe that. And so I took it on myself, and that's why I'm here. Yeah.
You mentioned that he was a Christian.
Yeah.
Now, did he keep the Ten Commandments? Now, you say he preached. Did he preach on the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath?
No, I don't think the Ten Commandments were that. I don't know how compelling that was to him. He was not incredibly doctrinaire in any of those ways, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'm going to say no. And then, like, first of all, it wasn't. He did. I think he probably did keep the Sabbath. I can't say that for certain. I think.
But what Sabbath? The first day of the week or the seventh day of the week?
Well, it depends on whose calendar you're using.
Now listen here. The Bible claims the fourth commandment That's the seventh day of the week. Sunday is the first day of the week.
Yeah, but all of this stuff.
So which day did he keep?
But William Apess wasn't worried about those things. I don't think that he was, and I don't even know that the Methodist community in general was using this sort of interpretation.
No, they use the first day of the week. This,
Sure.
all the rest.
As did most people, right? But I don't think that mattered to William Apess. And he will say over and over again, it's like I'm not doctrinaire. I'm not worried about denominational squabbles. He just wants people to be better Christians. He wants people to be better. Actually, he doesn't even want them to be better Christians. He wants them to be better humans. And he thinks that Christianity offers a way to maybe get there. So.